And we have two speakers, actually. This is going to be a joint talk. One speaker has gone the whole pandemic wearing a professional shirt up top, wearing crazier and crazier bike shorts where no one can see. And apparently the bike shorts have just gotten out of hand craziness. So, you know, yeah, all those crazy bike shorts. And the other speaker loves the reading, and his favorite book or book series or book, I'm not sure, is The Savage Detectives. Please, everyone, welcome Brooke and Ben.
We will let you guess which one of us is wearing crazy bike shorts. But my name is Ben. I'm a data scientist. My colleague and fellow presenter is Brook Frye. She's a senior data scientist. We are both with New York City Council. And we're here today to talk about data as part of the legislative process. So the data team's mission is to promote a data-driven approach to the council's decision-making process. Prior to this, it's largely been a very analytically informed process, and we wanted to bring a new edge to it, right? So we split our time between laws analysis and visualization. In regards to laws, mainly our responsibility is legislative input to acquire better data. Brooke's going to talk a little bit more about that later, but once we get good access to strong data, we can perform our analyses. And we've got a lot of folks with very strong backgrounds who can do a very good job of this. And of course, stronger analyses means stronger legislation and stronger policy. Lastly, in regards to visualization, our goal is always to make things clear and comprehensible, both for the council and the public. So we want to make sure we spend a lot of time conveying our results in ways that are useful. So I'm going to hand it over to Brooke. She's going to talk a little more now about the kinds of data we have access to.
Yeah, I'm just going to go over our most common data sources and other creative ways that we employ to get information that we need in order to investigate common problems relevant to the city of New York. So getting data happens to be a large part of our job, or sourcing data. We rely heavily on the Open Data Portal, which came to be because of Local Law 11 of 2012, more commonly known as the Open Data Law. It mandates that any information collected by mayoral agencies that are relevant, information that's relevant to the function of that agency, must be made public, and made public on a sort of searchable portal. So when the data that we need is not on that portal, we'll sort of look to other public data sources. We like to rely on the census data, American Community Survey for demographic information. We look to the 500 cities data portal put out by the CDC to get at modeled health metric data. And then we'll use Landsat data or satellite data to get information about the environment. When our data is not on the information superhighway proper, we'll get a little clever, and we will scrape data, or we'll arrange data sharing agreements with proprietary companies such as Safecraft. We used Safecraft during the pandemic to understand movement around the city during the pandemic. And finally, when we can't find it anywhere, we can't find the information that we need anywhere, we will rely on a really big tool that we have, the reporting bill tool. And reporting bills are what the city council sort of works on and uses in order to get information from the mayor's side of things relevant to their operations. And so mandates that the agencies report metrics, and those metrics get turned into data sets, and then back to the beginning, those data sets end up on the Open Data Portal. So a little bit more about the reporting bill process. It's a pretty collaborative process. We sit down with city council legislative staff to understand what the issue is, what the legal parameters are, and then what the best way to sort of get this information is. So we turn this sort of like issue or this sort of investigative problem into a quantitative question. One thing that we are constantly thinking about is spatiotemporal granularity. So how far down into the data do we need to drill in order to get the information necessary to answer the question? We always want, the most sort of granular information, but we do have to balance that with the privacy concerns of the average individual. So we have to sort of do this negotiation around like what is needed and what is unnecessary. And finally, because it's a law and because it is going to exist in perpetuity, we want to make sure that this law is future-proof. So we can't specify certain technologies that will eventually become obsolete. We know how fast that happens. So we can't, ask for data to be on like a CD-ROM, and then, we'd still be getting data on CD-ROMs, and we just have closets full of CD-ROMs, which are useless at this point, I think. Someone can argue with me about that. So an example of a reporting bill is the Benchmarking Energy Reporting Bill, Local Law 84 of 2012, which started with the question, what is the landscape of energy use by buildings in New York City? So we know that, or we knew anecdotally sort of, or through some like disparate research projects, that buildings are responsible for about 70%. That is a hard sort of estimate to really get precise on, but we know that buildings are the lion's share when it comes to producing greenhouse gases. And so we wanted to know what kinds of energy are being used and how can we ultimately use this information to reduce emissivity in a meaningful way in New York City. So yes, we needed more data. We didn't have this data at hand. So we wrote a law that mandated buildings of a certain size self-report their energy use each year. The privacy concerns weren't that interesting with this law, but we did sort of have to think about the scope of the bill. We weren't really concerned with an individual's use, so like single family homes. We were more concerned with these like sort of larger buildings that have more complicated energy issues. So we focused on buildings that are 25,000 square feet or more. They seem to be like that was like the right mark to get at sort of the issue, and then also to be able to affect the issue. And so, and then as far as making this future proof, well, we just want to be able to monitor this issue over the years. We want to make sure that we can track if buildings are doing better or worse, and when and where and why. So upon getting this data, we were able to do a little bit of investigation, and we wanted to sort of understand like globally, what is the distribution of greenhouse gas emissivity citywide. This chart shows you sort of chunked up into groups, and the unit is tons of carbon dioxide squared per square foot. And so we wanted to see, like where are the poorest performers, and where are the best performers, and is there any information we can get based on the characteristics of those buildings that would lead us to sort of more achievable and far-reaching greenhouse gas goals. So we looked at that data, and that data sort of led to this larger and more comprehensive plan called the Climate Mobilization Act of 2019, where we used benchmarking data to set greenhouse gas thresholds, greenhouse gas limits on certain buildings. So we began with the overall distribution. We looked at the worst performers, the best performers, and we thought about this goal that the city has had for a while now, that it wants to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. So how do we make it so that these buildings have sort of achievable targets and can reach goals in a meaningful way? So we looked at, we use XGBoost in R to predict emissivity. We pulled out the importance features, and we looked at those importance features as a way to sort of group buildings with like buildings. So the most important thing that we saw was that the work that's being done in a building is most predictive of how much, how the amount of greenhouse gases they're emitting. So we then grouped buildings with like buildings, and we defined thresholds. So if a hospital, there's one hospital in Queens that's doing terribly, but there's another hospital in Manhattan that's doing great. Well, it seems fair to say that this Queens hospital can maybe do a little bit better given that they're doing the same kind of work. The operation is very similar. So ultimately, we decided that for the first goal, we would look at the worst performers, the 20% at the tail end of the distribution, and we want them to reduce to the 80th percentile. So we need to move them over to the left, and then for the first goal, so get those really, really sort of bad actors essentially doing better, and then ultimately for the next goal, we need to get the whole entire distribution, except for maybe a couple, to get to the 20th percentile mark. So that's our sort of initiative, or our whole entire strategy in getting the city to get to become a little bit more energy efficient and less reliant on energy that produces greenhouse gases. So electrification of the grid, essentially. I'm going to pass it to Ben to talk about pay equity a little bit, another project that we've worked on.
Yes. So I guess in contrast to the climate work that Brook was just discussing, which ultimately led to strong legislation, pay equity is still in an ongoing oversight phase. So this is the result of Local Law 18/2019, which is another reporting bill that we passed. It took 8 years to get it through, and it provides the council with unprecedented access to information on pay disparities, allowing us to analyze them across protected categories. This effort was led within the council by Councilmember Cumbo, who we can see right here. Thank you to her. It really provides us with the opportunity to hold the city accountable for correcting pay disparities where they exist within the city workforce. Part of the reason why it took so long to get this data, though, to relate back to what Brook was mentioning regarding reporting bills, it's very important to take into account both privacy concerns and future proofing. So we have ultimately managed to get this through an API, and that's finally how we've gotten access to the PII for pretty much the entire city workforce.
I'll just jump in and talk a little bit about the model we chose and why we chose it. The data the structure of the data has some patterning. There's nesting that occurs. And so we wanted to account for that, as well as factors outside of protected classes, which we were first and foremost interested in, that might affect or might influence pay. So we had pay, the log of the salary as the outcome, and gender, race, ethnicity, and age. But then we had to control for many other covariates that might impact pay. We just to make a note there, because this is sort of like a bunch of disparate data sets that are sort of like put together, a lot of it had some, or a lot of the columns had some issues. So we wanted to include education level, but there was way too much missingness, so we just couldn't. But regardless, we ended up with a pretty strong model. We accounted for the nesting that happens within agencies. So an agency might have, there might be an agency that has a title that is across many different agencies, but that title might mean something totally different across the different agencies. And then that in and of itself might impact pay. So we wanted to account for that sort of interness that happens. So we had random effects on agency, and random effects on agency and the title level. And I'll give it back to Ben.
Yeah, so as a result of the mixed model that Brooke is discussing there, we were able to compare essentially the unadjusted and adjusted pays according to the protected classes. So at the top of this page, you'll see the unadjusted pay is the raw comparison of race, ethnicity, and gender. And at the bottom, we have controlling for length of service, civil service title, code, suffix, and level, the agency, and the managerial status of the individual. Now, in the adjusted pay, you can kind of see within a couple of cents, most of those pays are pretty close to $1. But in the unadjusted pay, it's significantly different than that. And that, we believe, is more or less due to opportunity access. So if you have the same job and the same experience, you're going to get more or less the same pay, given that we, like Brooke mentioned, don't have all access to factors like education. It may or may not explain some of those cents on the dollar differences. And so that is something to look into in the future. But we know for sure that the higher paying jobs are overwhelmingly held by men over women and by white people over people of color. Just as an example, at the bottom of this screen, this is basically FDNY job titles grouped by their median salaries. And women are, in red, very well represented in many of the lower paying job positions within the FDNY, and increasingly less so as the pay scales go up. And ultimately, at the very top of that pay scale, completely unrepresented. So while we don't know for sure, at least the model that we have can't necessarily speak to all these factors, undoubtedly historical inequalities, maternity, education access, poverty factors are all very much related to this. Now, the good news, at least from our end, is that this will be an annual report. And so some of the questions that we couldn't answer now or can't necessarily see, back into the past now, we can continue to examine moving forward, to continue to provide oversight in an attempt to correct these trends.
And I just want to mention that this pay equity analysis was specific to the New York City workforce. We know that things sort of play out differently elsewhere, but because we have these civil service titles that sort of track people pretty tightly, there is like a little bit more equity when it comes to, job title and promotions and whatnot, with the caveat that, women and people of color often have less access to higher paying jobs.
Thank you.
No problem. So yeah, sorry, go for it.
No worries. Just to talk about challenges, right? We've talked about two examples where we've had quite a lot of success in the council, but we do also run into ongoing issues. One of them, and really the main one that leads to the others, is the proactive nature of the work that we try and complete versus the reactive political cycle. So inevitably, the council being a legislative and political body, we're sort of on a sort of news cycle within the city. And we do have to, as a result, sometimes respond very quickly to new things that come, or we have to work with data either that doesn't, as of when it's important, have the level of granularity that we're looking for, or that might have high missingness. In both cases, it's sort of like a garbage in, garbage out situation. So that can limit our effectiveness when we're on a tight cycle.
Totally. But we're often successful, and we should focus on that, I guess. And the reason why we're successful is because we have had support from leadership, especially the Speaker of the City Council, Corey Johnson, has believed in since the beginning data-driven legislative decision-making process and sort of using data to inform us in all ways. We also find it I think, I mean, I find it really meaningful to engage with the larger council staff and the public in general. And visualizations is the best way to do that. Just getting people to understand and be sort of like kind of involved with the process of data analysis. You see a more sort of informed and engaged citizen, and it's really fun to see that process. And we're also just, our backgrounds make us expert in reframing legislative ideas or big ideas into quantitative questions and sort of more scientific, science-based sort of approaches. So in summary, we're just here trying to make laws a little bit smarter to improve the lives of New Yorkers. And thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. That's one of the things about this conference is that it's government and public sector, and we have all levels of government. We have federal, we have state, we have local, we have NGOs. So it's nice to see a local government talk. I know that New York has been at the forefront of data analysis for quite some time. That's been a nice thing to see the city embrace data, both as a community in the city, but also from the government on down. So thank you very much both for the talk and for bringing data to government.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jared.